The only sound was Twilight's breathing, permeating through the thick darkness that enveloped her. This heavy breathing was Twilight's only comfort, as at the moment it was really the only thing she could tell that she was alive. When she felt some degree of safety, since her pendant was remaining quiet, just like everything else in this place, the silence was discontenting enough that in combination with the pitch-dark room she found herself in, she feared for her life just as much as if there was a monster getting ready to slice her in half. At this point, the one thing that the unicorn wanted most was to see again, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get the room to light up. Even though she knew she had the energy and was performing a light spell perfectly, she could even feel the light coming from her horn, yet the darkness around her remained. She concentrated harder, giving more energy to the spell. She knew the spell would have grown brighter, and yet no light penetrated the area around her. With an exasperated breath, she let the spell dissipate into the air and then tried to absorb as much remaining unused magic back into a reservoir as possible. The strain from her chronic use of magic over the past few hours was starting to get to her, a testament to how dire her situation was, considering her natural magical power was much higher than the average unicorn's. The exhaustion was worse on her mind, as it was only causing her thoughts to become clouded and problem-solving to be more difficult. The thought of losing her wits as well as dealing with diminishing magical abilities terrified her. Losing free use of any spell she might need was bad enough, as that ability was what kept her alive so far. But to be deprived of both magic and intellect was all but a death sentence. Rather than fill herself with any more dread by pondering how her situation could deteriorate any further, she decided it was better to instead take stock of how her situation was right then. She still had a tally of the items that was stored inside of her spell-crafted holding space right then, mostly notes and books that she was hoarding. She wasn't sure what was compelling her to hold on to them, but she felt these items were somehow necessary. She also had the health drink bottle from the library, though she was unsure of what use it would be at the moment. Maintaining the storage spell was only a little bit taxing. The thing that had used up most of her magic was using her sword. She had been wielding the sword with fear, gripping it harder than was necessary. She knew it was a rookie mistake, an easy way to get you exhausted when you found yourself in prolonged danger. She could still remember practicing with her sword as a filly. "Hiya!" Twilight cried out as she swung the wooden sword at the guard as hard as he could. The weapon struck dirt as the guard simply stood to the side and levitated his own sword towards the filly, before again striking down against her head. "Ow!" The young student rubbed her head as the sword had been fell to the ground. "That hurt." "It hurt because you not only let your guard down, but you attacked at an inopportune time," the unicorn explained as he returned the floating sword to his side. "You're also gripping your sword too hard. You need to grip it that hard when unleashing a devastating strike." "I know that." The lavender filly huffed as she stood up, planting her hooves against the ground and forcing her magic to her horn once more. The grip of her spell surrounded the wooden sword they had provided her, and she lifted it up to her side. "That's too much magic. You're gripping it as though you're trying to break it into splinters." The unicorn guard shook his head in disapproval. The little filly unicorn just huffed in annoyance once more and tried to reduce the grip of her spell. It seemed so much easier to just study magic as the princess's prized pupil. Though she'd been curious about practicing with swords, the guards she occasionally sparred with always complained about how she was doing it wrong. It was starting to annoy her. "Too little," the guard said, striking Twilight's sword with his own and knocking the wooden sword from her grip. "You need to have just enough strength so that if struck, you won't lose grip of the sword, but not enough so quickly to exhaust your magic." "Ah! When am I ever going to use this?" The filly stomped her hooves against the ground. Now she really was regretting giving up precious study time for this silly hobby. "You're always going to use this," the unicorn guard explained, tossing Twilight to glare at him in disbelief. "As the princess's student, you're tasked with learning as much about magic as you can, so you should already be aware of the fact that how much magic you put into your spells and how much the spell changes. Don't put enough magic into your spells, and it doesn't work. Put too much, and the reaction causes your spell to become something different entirely. The guard pointed his wooden sword at Twilight. Combat forces you to be aware of this at all times, to instinctively channel your magic to just the right amount. Never too little, never too much. You may never have to raise a sword to a foe, and I pray to Celestia that day where you have to never comes. But the fundamentals of what you are learning here will stay with you forever. The little filly huffed angrily yet again. She was being lectured and she knew it. Begrudgingly, she lit up her horn and grabbed her weapon once more. "Fine," she said while raising the sword. "But I only want to spar for a few more minutes. I want to return to my studies." "I have no objections." The unicorn nodded, preparing himself once more. Something loudly crashed in the darkness. Caught off guard in her own thoughts, Twilight screamed, fumbling over her hooves to get away from whatever it was that had made the racket. Her legs struck something hard as she fumbled forward. Her chin struck the ground, and she felt something wet splash against her face. She groaned as her chin ached. Her pendant was beginning to flicker, light slowly filling the darkness that had surrounded her. She sat up, rubbing her jaw, careful of how she sat with the burns still aching on her back legs and flank. She could feel the liquid that had splashed on her face. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light that was now filtering into the room. Twilight wasn't even sure that she was in the same place anymore. The interior decor that she was beginning to see didn't look like anything that she'd find in Rarity's boutique. She was even beginning to wish she wasn't seeing it at all, wanting a room to revert to the ruin it had been before. Rusted sheets of steel had taken the place of the normal boutique walls, each splattered with blood, as though some gruesome occurrence had taken place next to them. The destroyed curtains no longer made of any kind of cloth, but instead seemed to be made out of skin, stretched and torn in several places. The normal decorations of the boutique were replaced with rusted chains and grime. Twilight looked down at her legs to try and avert her gaze from the horrific scene, and to see what she tripped over. It was the body of that creature in the armor she'd killed before the world had changed around her. The liquid she had landed in was its blood. She grimaced, finding her stomach flip. She carefully stepped away from the body, not wanting to step in any more of the blood that had pooled around it. She glanced around the boutique once more, looking for a rag or cloth with which to wipe the blood off. But the only things like that, anything remotely like a cloth, were the skins hanging from the curtains, and wiping the blood off with them just seemed just as nauseating as having the blood on her face in the first place. She reached into her magic reservoir and pulled out one of the scrolls she had been keeping, the one with nonsensical scribbles plastered over it. She still couldn't discern if any of the scribbles held anything of importance. For all she knew, it was there to block the original cryptic runic symbols. She grumbled with the importance of the paper and closed her eyes. The scroll wasn't very absorbent, and therefore it wasn't picking up the blood that had splattered on her face very well. But as she wiped hard, as she was able to get as much blood as possible off her face, she knew she wasn't getting it all. She was certain there were some smudges left, but she felt better knowing most of it was off her face. Twilight returned the now bloodied scroll to her magic reservoir, while looking at the body she had tripped over. She adjusted the light to look towards its head, spotting the handle of her sword that was still buried deep within it. She grimaced, quickly realizing that she was going to have to pull the sword out. She hesitated for a moment, but her horn lit up with magic all the same. The handle was wrapped, giving her a good grip of the sword. She tugged on it, hoping it would slide out without much effort, but the sword barely moved, simply nudging to the side of her. Twilight grunted and pulled a little harder. The body was dragging along the ground by the handle of the sword. A realization struck her once again, flipping her stomach. The sword was stuck fast in the creature's body, and forcing it out would be much likely to mutilate it beyond recognition. She closed her eyes and clasped a hoof over her mouth. Her stomach was rebelling, and it wanted to expel its contents. Her resolve was shaking. She tried to remind herself why she needed the sword, the very same reason that it had found itself embedded into the creature in the first place. She needed it so she could defend her life from the creatures that wished to snuff it out. She couldn't help her friends, the citizens of Ponyville, the princess, or Spike, if she was dead. She gulped down the contents of her stomach and opened her eyes, wrapping a separate section of magic around the armored creature's head and neck. With a soft grunt, she pulled the two sections in opposite directions, feeling the objects catch on each other and refuse to budge. She grit her teeth and steadied her stance before lowering her horn and channeling more magic into it. The force made the sword begin to wobble, as though it was about to come out. The body oozed more blood from its mouth as she persisted in trying to retrieve her only weapon. A loud snap echoed throughout the building as Twilight felt something give way. Her eyes widened as she lifted up the sword to view what had become of the creature. Most of the blade had stayed embedded within the creature, due to the age, wear, and rust on the sword she had picked up. All that remained now was a small, jagged stump of metal that used to be a sword. Oh no. Twilight felt her heart sink. Her sword had been the difference between life and death. Without it, she would certainly... A shiver ran down her back, sticking her hair on end at the thought. She looked the broken sword over carefully, noticing how sharp and jagged the edge was now. The blade only extended out about 3 inches now, the sides still sharp enough, though admittedly a bit chipped. Twilight had a feeling that the jagged ends of the sword would likely snap off too, if too much pressure was applied to them, but that still left it as a means to defend herself. She would just have to use it as a dagger instead. As long as she didn't run into any more of those soldier-like weapon-brandishing creatures, she could manage to defend herself. I don't want to kill anything swiftly, though. She spoke aloud to herself, slashing the impromptu dagger through the air. The length of the blade had been what allowed her to kill quickly, so far, minimalizing the chances of being hurt by a retaliatory attack. But now she'd have to stab it until the creature bled to death. Not an option she'd liked. She vanished the dagger into her magic and took a deep breath, calming her senses. She opened her eyes back to the horrible world she now found herself in, able to smell blood wafting through the air. She turned her head to where the front door had been, expecting to see the shattered remains of where the creature had come in. Instead, she saw the same blood-splattered steel blocking the door. An idea sparked in her head as she examined where the door had been and remembered how her attacker had chipped the door to bits. She quickly looked around the floor, trying to find the double-headed axe that the soldier had been wielding. To her ever-growing luck, it seemed to have vanished. The body of the soldier was still there, but the weapon it had been using was gone. Twilight sighed in defeat. It seemed like she wasn't going to be getting a replacement weapon that easily. The lavender unicorn then focused on her pendant and turned it to look around the room, trying to locate a possible exit. Her light fell upon a rather large wooden door located exactly where the 3 viewing mirrors had been placed when she saw the shadowed creature. She gulped, fear gripping her throat. She had a feeling that going through the door meant that she was going to see the shadowed figure again. The thought terrified her, but it was the only door that now remained within Carousel Boutique, even if she hesitated to call it that anymore. Twilight hesitated before walking into it. She stopped as heat tore through her haunches once more, biting her lip as the remainder of her burns struck her mind. During the tense moments when adrenaline and endorphins had been coursing through her blood, she had forgotten about the pain that assaulted the back of her legs. Not only was her offensive capabilities reduced, but her ability to walk was hindered. She tried to push it to the side of her mind, stepping carefully so as not to agitate her hind legs as she walked up to the door that was now conspicuously in the middle of the building. She raised her hoof to the door, expecting to be locked just as every other door she'd encountered, and pushed against it. The door let out a rusted squeal as it slowly swung open. Twilight was surprised at how heavy the door actually turned out to be, as it opened to reveal a stairwell that led down to the dark abyss. The unicorn was confused, not having expected there to be a basement of any sorts below Rarity's workshop, especially not one that was located in the middle of her showroom. The lavender unicorn pushed the thoughts aside, trying to remind herself that wherever she wasn't at Rarity's place of business anymore. Rarity would gag and faint at the sight of what had become her workshop. Aiming the light of her pendant down the stairs, she began to make her way down the stone steps. The walls lining the staircase looked to be made of strange cobblestone, which she thought she'd recognized, but wasn't quite sure where to place her hoof on it. Each wall was covered with dark green mold that seemed to be sliding downward, with blood splattered all over it, just like the room above. The bottom of the stairs came up behind her quickly. Her hooves clopped against the dark stone floor below. She turned her eyes up to the wall in front of her and gasped, almost jumping back in surprise. There was a large mural depicting Nightmare Moon in a threatening pose facing the pony viewing it. The visage of the Mare of Darkness loomed over her, her eyes glaring white, and the armor covering her body as it had the night twilight had confronted her. It took her a moment to realize the mural wasn't moving, that the Mare of Darkness wasn't actually standing before her at that very moment. Her eyes scanned the mural more carefully, noticing a strange outline digging into the picture. She traced the shape with her eyes and realized that it was a door the mural had been directly painted over. Twilight placed a hoof against the door and pushed. Nothing. The door didn't even so much as budge. She ran her hoof along it and felt it slip inward a little. She blinked and looked closer. Part of the mural was missing, specifically the chest piece of Nightmare Moon. The moon-adorning mantle she wore wasn't there, and in its place was an indentation into the wall in the same shape. "This day just keeps getting weirder," she murmured softly, putting her hoof back on the ground. She turned her head to look at the rest of the hallway. The hallways were still made up of the same stone material that the stairs had been made of, though there were less grime on these particular rocks, and more splatters of dried blood. The stench finally reached her nose, and she gagged slightly, realizing that she was already starting to get used to the smell of blood in the air everywhere. The hallway was narrow, but not what she expected to find in a basement. The building materials didn't even seem similar to that of the boutique, as if it had been built before the boutique had been put on top of it. The door before her was locked for now, and the hallway went down to her right and left, seeming in the same either direction. Taking a wild guess, Twilight began to walk down the right path. Her hooves struck the stone ground as she walked, the echoes bouncing off the walls loudly. The creeping darkness still sent an unsettling chill up her spine. Anything could be lurking in the shadows, just waiting for her to attack. The echo of her hoofsteps offered no comfort against the knowledge that her medallion could still go off at any moment. The hallway made a sharp turn to the left suddenly, causing Twilight to hesitate. She carefully peeked around the corner, illuminating the path before her with her pendant. She saw the hallway come to a dead end at another wooden door placed in the wall. She crept around to the corner and walked up to the door. She placed her hoof against it and summoned the dagger-length sword to her side. She would be ready for anything that lay in wait on the other side. At least, she hoped she would. The door creaked open. Her rune remained silent in the light hit the room, but her eyesight instantly caught on something wrong. Hanging from the ceiling were several blood-red vines, with plant-like weeds matching the vines snaking along the ceiling. It was as if the ceiling itself was a plant. From the ends of a few of the vines, she could see a dark red liquid dripping onto the ground. She could only guess what it was exactly. The stone walls were covered in rusted chains that seemed to be keeping the stones in place. The stone floor had several cracks that the liquid dripping from the ceiling seeped into. Twilight cautiously walked into the room and shut the door behind her. She couldn't see anything of particular interest towards the front of the room, but she couldn't just leave it unexplored. She carefully walked towards the center of the room, not knowing what to expect. A drop of liquid hit the top of her head as she shivered, feeling it on her body. She heard something shift in the room, and her medallion began to buzz. She instantly turned towards the source of the sound. There was an opening in the wall to her left that seemed to go into a separate section of the room. However, two things appeared to be in the way. The first was a stone altar that appeared to be missing 3 square indents on the top. Behind it was a gigantic creature that seemed to be stretched taut across the opening. It was bound by 2 large circles, one on the ceiling and one on the floor, each circle covered in large protruding spikes aimed for the creature's body. Its body was attached to the wall by large hooks, stretching its ragged skin taut. Twilight could see several muscles through rips in the creature's skin, the creature's blood dripping from the wounds. Its head appeared to be small, though Twilight could only assume it was a head. It seemed to have a mouth that opened slightly, only for it to take a breath. Its lower half appeared to have been forcibly ripped off, though no entrails hung from it. She couldn't discern what kind of creature it had been. It was unlike anything Twilight had ever seen before. She held her former sword out before her, waiting for the creature to attack. Her medallion was buzzing, telling her it was a threat. She wasn't about to be caught off guard by an attack from it. The creature only seemed to slightly move within its confines, the hooks digging into its flesh as it breathed and the hanging flesh on the lower half of the body brushing against the ground as it moved. It didn't even seem to make a sound, content to just stand in its designated spot, blocking her path. She looked at the creature, trying to discern its purpose, but it only persisted in remaining still. Very cautiously, Twilight looked around the room. There was nothing else in there, only the monster and the altar before her. She looked back at the altar before the monster, making note of the 3 empty indents that it presented. So, I need to find the armor piece, the mural, and I need to find 3 squares for this creature. She mentally noted, stepping away from the creature and back towards the door. The further she grew, the quieter her medallion became. Grabbing the door with her magic, she opened it, and backed out slowly, closing it behind her. The medallion grew silent, prompting her to let out a sigh of relief. They can't just make this easy on me. The lavender unicorn whispered to herself. She put the sword back into a reservoir and looked at the dead end of the hallway. I guess that means the answer's the other way. A soft curse came from her lips for picking the wrong way. She passed the mural again and reached a sharp turn to her right, just as she was going down the other hallway. The hallway had led to a dead end and a wooden door, same as the other hallway. She placed her hoof against the door and opened it, peering inside with the light of her pendant. The room was just as different from the hallway and the last room had been. Instead of the grime-ridden stone, this room was adorned with brown stone tiles, as though the room belonged in one of Equestria's many discarded ruins. This room also had the telltale splatters of blood along the walls, but what stuck out the most was at the wall directly across from the door. Twilight carefully walked up to it, not understanding what she was seeing. There were 3 separate sheets of glass, allowing her to look inside of 3 boxes kept in the wall. Each box contained an environment, each one different from the other. The leftmost contained a beautiful jungle, kept pristine within its glass. She could see luscious greens and beautiful flowers inside. A second tree seemed to dominate the back of the box, and filled the ceiling with bountiful branches. The middle box contained what seemed to be a murky field. Grass covered the floor, but was damped with water. Above the ground was a dark black cloud that covered the entire ceiling, threatening to rain at any moment. The third window seemed to contain a bookshelf and a ladder. Each of the books seemed indistinguishable from one another, yet brimming with knowledge all the same. None of them had any dust, indicating that they were well kept, but no one was there to read them. Twilight viewed the scenes curiously, not sure what they meant. Each one contained a theme, but what did the theme mean? She shook her head slowly, trying to take a mental note of the scenes before turning around to look at the rest of the room. It contained nothing more than the scenes and another door. With nothing left to do in the room, the unicorn inspected the second door before opening it. Huh? Twilight wondered aloud while walking in. There was a strange contraption taking up the entirety of the room. It appeared to be a cage of some sort, though the ceiling and floor was made out of the same cobblestone from the hallways, and the bars inside only went about 3/4 the way before meeting a wall, as though it were a guardrail. The front of it had an open door, and inside the door she spotted a lever. The unicorn spared a moment before stepping into the cage, expecting the door to have shut closed behind her. She turned to look at the lever, not sure what its placement within the cage accomplished. If she locked the cage, that simply meant she could flip a lever and escape once more. Taking a gamble, she raised her hoof and pulled the lever down. As she expected, the door to the cage closed in front of her. What a silly contraption! Twilight murmured softly to herself, raising her hoof to flip the lever the other way, when the entirety of the cage suddenly lurched. Twilight stumbled away from the door, trying to keep her balance as the entire cage began to move. The cage grew pitch black, save for the shining of her pendant. Twilight turned her attention to the walls that were moving upwards just beyond the steel bars. The entire thing was moving down, as though it were automated to. The unicorn was rendered speechless. Of all the things she had expected to happen, the cage taking her somewhere else was not what she had even considered. With nothing to do but wait for it to all stop moving, her mind quickly went over the layout of the boutique in her mind. She couldn't conceive such an intricate basement was resting beneath Ponyville, let alone the boutique itself. She had been feeling as though she was in some sort of otherworldly place ever since she had heard the droning of the siren. The cage lurched once more, almost knocking Twilight off of her hooves. The entire contraption stopped, and dim light began to filter into the cage once more. The door opened up, revealing the room before her. She carefully stepped out of the cage to view a rather large set of wooden double doors just before her. They looked like they belonged in a castle. After walking up to the doors, she pressed her hooves against them and pushed. With a heavy creaking, the doors gave way, allowing her to access the room that lay beyond them. The hallway she encountered was gigantic in comparison to the one she had been through, easily large enough to be one of the hallways in Canterlot Castle. A moth-eaten red carpet stretched from the door across the entire hall. The grime and blood-soaked stones lined the walls and floor. She couldn't see the ceiling unless she aimed her pendant straight at it, and the large windows, which normally contained stained glass pictures, were instead covered with the rusted, blood-spattered steel she'd seen on the first floor of the boutique. Twilight's eyes were drawn to the center of the hallway, where a square marble pillar stood, holding a glass case atop it. She spotted something inside that was glistening off the light of her pendant. Twilight approached the marble pillar to see what was inside. The buzzing of her medallion froze her in place, however. She was instantly looking around for the source of the sound. Her ears perked up, hearing the sound of stone being scraped by metal. She whirled around, looking for the soldier she was expecting to be there. The scraping of metal continued, the buzzing of her medallion growing louder. But no matter where she looked, she couldn't spot the creature. Her heart began to race, her breathing growing short as she felt herself slipping into panic. She was right on top of a monster and couldn't even see it. She could feel sweat forming on her forehead as she stepped back, bumping into the marble pillar. A loud crack came from above, and Twilight snapped her gaze upward, spotting movement. She quickly aimed her pendant and saw what was crawling on the ceiling. A mask was looking down at her, a theater mask that covered the entire pony's face, one half red, the other half white. It had no eye or mouth holes to speak of. The creature was staring down at her, with no way of seeing her. Its body was covered in tattered brown cloak that only covered its body. The feet that dug into the ceiling... No, they weren't feet. They looked more like skin-colored sickles. Each sharpened appendage moved forward and dug into the stones before it, causing the metallic scraping she had heard. The creature's mask was pointed in her direction, though the head of the creature was upside down. Twilight couldn't breathe as they stared at the creature slowly, making its way across the ceiling. The head of the creature snapped, twisting its head back around to view the ceiling. Twilight winced, and the creature's movements suddenly sped up. The scraping of the metal as it moved its scythes along the ceiling echoed. Twilight followed it with her pendant, watching it escape into a hole in the ceiling. The medallion grew quiet as the creature moved out of sight. That can't be good. Twilight gulped, thankful for the return of the silence. However, a new dread swept over her as she realized that those creatures really could come from anywhere. That creature could have easily jumped down on her And then what would she do? She needed to find a new weapon. Her dagger of a sword wasn't going to cut it against creatures like that. Twilight turned back to the marble pillar, giving it her attention for the moment. Inside of the glass case, she could see what was without a doubt one piece of the chest piece. It was a colored dark blue with half a circle in light blue in the center. This must be the missing piece from the mural. Twilight murmured to herself, looking it over. It looked exactly like it had come from the mural in the wall. Twilight raised a hoof to the glass and pressed on it, trying to move it. It seemed firmly stuck in place. Twilight thought for a moment, trying to figure out what she could do to get the mural piece. She lit her horn and wrapped the glass in her magic, trying to lift it off the marble pillar, but the glass remained in place. The unicorn focused on just the front section of glass, calling upon one of the many spells she'd worked so hard to memorize upon the glass. She raised a hoof and pressed it to where she had cast her spell, expecting her hoof to phase through the glass. Instead, it was met once more by the solid glass. At this point, she knew it wasn't the spell that had failed, but rather the word around her was messing with her magic. Guess I'll just try busting it open. Twilight sighed in exasperation, pulling out her dwarfed sword. She aimed the handle towards the glass and took a few steps back. She raised the handle well above her head and brought it swinging down as hard as she could against the glass. The resulting strike was a loud thud that briefly echoed before going quiet. The glass didn't even have a scratch on it. I guess I'm not getting it this way. Twilight put the sword away, glaring wearily at the piece behind the glass. It was bad enough that her flank stung from the burns, that she could be attacked at any moment without a proper means to defend herself, and that she had no idea why any of this was happening. But now the world seemed fit to mock her by defying everything she had ever come to know about the way glass worked. I'll be back for you. Twilight pointed at the glass with a hoof, as though it were able to hear her. She then stepped around it and looked towards the opposite end of the hallway, seeing another large pair of doors that led further into the decaying stone basement.